So officially, good evening. What we're going to do this evening is begin a series, and I don't know how many this will be, but I know it's going to take at least three studies. It could take a few more. And the title is Lessons from the Life of Joseph. Now, this is Joseph, son of Jacob. There are several Josephs mentioned in the Bible. You know, Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph, Christ's stepfather, and so forth. But this is Joseph, son of Jacob. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I was toying with two or three different topics that I might begin another Bible study series on. And then we had a sermonette by a gentleman named Brian Wilhelm out in Sturgis on the weekly Sabbath following the feast. And he just in a sermonette did a very quick synopsis of a little bit of the lessons from Joseph's life. And that inspired me. I listened closely to that sermonette, and then I knew that's going to be my next topic. So we're going to launch into it this evening. Joseph, I would call him a fourth generation servant of God with a very, very interesting life that we can learn a lot from. You might even say fifth generation, but I'll comment about that in a moment. You know, if there's a one sentence summary of Jacob's life, it might be this. Jacob, who went from being a favored and somewhat spoiled child to a teenager to becoming a slave, then becoming a prisoner, and then becoming a national leader in God's service. And that's kind of an amazing progression through life, isn't it? But I think that's a pretty good one sentence summary. I also want to comment about something later in Joseph's life, and we'll get to that in a later study. But, you know, Joseph broke a cycle of bad behavior, although he had some of his own issues as well, and we'll cover those in succeeding studies. But he really broke a cycle of bad behavior in his family history. And so, what I want to cover primarily this evening is what I think is quite an interesting background to Joseph, beginning with his ancestry. And I'm only going to go back four generations or mention a fifth. So, I'd like to immediately go to the Bible. We're going to be in Genesis virtually the entire Bible study this evening. So I want you to note Genesis chapter 11 with me as we begin to study the people who were ancestors to Joseph. And we learn a lot of family traits and so forth. And I found this more interesting than ever as I began to study it. But if you're with me in Genesis chapter 11, near the end of that chapter, I'd like you to note verses 31 and 32 with me. Genesis 11, verse 31, it says, and Terah, now Terah was Abraham or Abram's father. So Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And I'm going to show you on a map here in a bit for those of you that have video, and I'll describe it for those of you with audio only, exactly what this trip was like. But they don't go directly from Ur of the Chaldeans to Canaan. They first go up, and this is a general northwesterly direction to Haran or Haran, and it says they dwelt there. So they spend a period of time there, and we really don't know how long that is. And then it just abruptly ends here, verse 32. So the days of Terah were 205 years. This man lived a very long time, and he died. He died up there in Haran. So maybe we could say Terah was also a very faithful man of God. We just don't know much about him. We're immediately, though, going to go to the next generation, and that, of course, is Abraham. But at this point, he is still known as Abram. There's a very interesting commentary on this trip that these people took, and it's very lengthy, but I want to read just a few quotes from an article that is titled Footsteps of Abraham. And this article was written by a fellow named Malachi Martin. You know, that first name, Malachi, you might assume he was Jewish. He actually was not. Malachi Martin was an Irish American, and he was a religious scholar. He wrote, I believe, around 30 books. But what I'm quoting from is an article that was published in the New York Times back in 1983. So it's fairly recent history here. Here's the first quote from Malachi Martin. Today, Ur is a desert scrubland with miserable ruins jutting from terrain of sand and mud. It is about 120 miles northwest of the Persian Gulf in the country we now call Iraq. And Iraq has been in the news so much in the last 30 years or so. I think we all know where that is, in the Middle East. Now, I want to continue another quote from the article. In Abraham's day, Ur was then a capital city of more than 100,000 inhabitants, a place of beauty, graced with towers, palaces, temples, law courts, market squares, statues, shrines, gardens, mosaics, paved streets lined with two-story houses. Here's another interesting quote. It had its own seaport and man-made canal giving access to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, which opened it up to lucrative foreign markets in the areas we call Africa, India, and then places further away. But Malachi Martin adds something in that article. Quote, Ur was also a place where more than 500 different gods and goddesses were worshipped. So it was clearly a very pagan place, even though it was a highly developed place in its era. Now, here's another quote from a different source, the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges. Just one sentence from that article, it says, in other words, Ur, was the principal seat of the worship of the moon god, Sin. Interesting name, Sin, S-I-N, down in southern Babylonia. Now, that same source, the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, also states that Haran, like Ur, was also a center of the worship of the moon god Sin. So, leaving Ur and moving up to Haran didn't remove Terah and Abram and that traveling party from a pagan environment. I want to share my screen right now with you and show you a little bit of what that journey was like. I trust this is showing to everyone. It's just my title slide, but I want to begin with this evening just with a little bit of a geography lesson. Excuse me. I hope you can see my screen, those of you with video, and for the rest of you, I'll describe this. Ur is down near the Persian Gulf, and near this yellow triangle, for those of you with video. That's where they set out on this long, meandering journey, which in general, and of course, some scholars are very honest. They don't exactly know where the trails and paths and roads were in that era, but it seems very obvious. It runs up the valley of the Euphrates River. That would certainly be easier for travel. And they made their way all the way up in a northwesterly direction to Haran or Haran, which today would be in eastern Turkey. Now, this is quite a distance, possibly 700 miles or more. And keep in mind, they were either walking or riding on animals and likely had some carts. And so this is the first part of Terah, Abram, Lot, and Sarai's and their traveling party. This is the first part of the journey up here to Haran. Now that's where Terah died. This is the next slide, same map. Now we're going to look at the second part of this journey over towards the left here, where they make their way down, get over near the Mediterranean Sea, and then make their way down into what was then the land of Canaan, the promised land, although we know Abraham, Isaac, Jacob never inherited that. Later on, the Israelites did, but that's where they wandered. That's where they lived in tents and temporary dwellings. Later on, due to famine in the land, Abraham went clear on over into Egypt, down around the southeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. One source indicated this is right at 1,500 miles. And to give you some idea of what that would be today in our country, we have some precious brethren all the way up near the Canadian border in the area near Minot, North Dakota. Okay, if you went from Minot, North Dakota, all the way down to San Antonio, Texas, you would have walked or ridden an animal or ridden in a cart about the same distance that Abram, Lot, Sarai, and the band with them traveled all the way from Ur up to Haran and then back down to Canaan and then later over into Egypt. Now, I'm not counting even the return trip back from Egypt, just this long meandering route, about 1,500 miles. It shows the faith and the commitment of Abraham. Actually, I just put this other box in with that same information that I just related to you. So it's rather amazing, I think. Here's another map of the last part of the journey. This comes from our own UCG Bible commentary on Genesis chapter 12. There's a map inserted in that too, and that shows a little more of the locations here. Down in the area, Shechem, Bethel, Gerar, Beersheba. Up here is Dan. How often? I've never counted, but the phrase from Dan unto Beersheba, that essentially encompassed the land of Canaan and later the land of Israel. So this is a very important area, and this is where Abram, later known as Abraham, followed by Isaac, sojourned during, all of Isaac's life and much of Abraham's life. I'm going to stop sharing the slides for now. I will take that down, go back speaking to you face to face. I do want to bring that back up later on to show one more slide. But it is interesting, I think, when we looked at that map and you see a visual of what it meant when the Lord told Abraham. Matter of fact, let's just go to that now. Genesis chapter 12. I might as well read that with you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, you get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And then that first great promise, I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And I might remind you, I'm not going to turn there, but in Hebrews 11, where it talks about the faithful, Abraham being mentioned prominently in that chapter, it says he left, not knowing where he was going, but he had that kind of faith. I think that's amazing. Now, this is part of the stock from which Joseph came. There's some really noble characteristics of these people. Very faithful, very committed, and Abram demonstrated his faith very early here in the accounts that we read in the Bible. Abram spends the rest of his life down there in that general area of Canaan, living in tents. And Hebrews 11 says that, dwelt in tents, along with Isaac and with Jacob, waiting for their permanent home, which is the same permanent home you and I are waiting for and looking forward to. That city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now, I'm quoting phrases there from Hebrews 11. So, remember what I read here a bit ago? What did Abraham give up, if you look at it that way? Well, he left a very advanced civilization down there in Ur, the paved streets, the two-story houses, and all the palaces and so forth, and went to live in a tent the rest of his life. These are the people, the forefathers of Joseph. There's some very noble characteristics in this family. Now, I'm just going to skim a lot of things. I'm not going to do a lot of verse by verse commentary, as I will later in the Bible study, part 2, when we really get into Joseph's life specifically. But let's hit some high spots. Genesis chapter 24. Turn ahead to Genesis chapter 24, please. It also states this in an earlier place, and when I say this, I'm going to note just a couple of verses with you. If you're with me now in Genesis 24, would you please begin reading with me verse 34? The context is the trusted steward that Abraham had sent to seek a wife for Isaac. And so this is the steward who is now up there he's back up, by the way, near Haran. And in verse 34, here's what he said: I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master greatly, and he has become great. And he has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. Now, the reason I turned here, Abraham was a very wealthy, successful man. There's a lot of business savvy in this family. Matter of fact, let's just go on and note something else about his son Isaac. Let's turn to Genesis 26. Just turn ahead, please, a couple of chapters to Genesis 26. Now we're going to talk about the next generation, Isaac, son of Abraham, the son of promise. If you turned ahead to chapter 26, please read with me in verse 12. Verse 12 says, Then Isaac sowed in that land. By the way, he's now in that part of Canaan around Gerar. So he sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. So a tremendous crop, a farmer here. And it says, the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. So it's really making the point here. Here is a very, very successful man. Now, verse 14, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him. Here he is, a sojourner, if you will, down in their land. But, they're looking at this fellow. So how did he get all of this? So There's something very interesting here. These people are very prosperous, and I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. They clearly have business savvy, if you will. They're good managers. And again, these are the ancestors of Joseph. And think about what he did later. But for now, let's keep dwelling on this. Now, part of this was due to God's blessings, and I understand that, and that's what it said. But also, we have to acknowledge their own industriousness and their own ability to manage. How many of you have known people who have been given a lot and failed to maintain it or even outright squandered it? I have. I've seen that. These men did not. These men have a lot of ability. Now, continuing with this next generation, Isaac, I want you to turn back now, a little more about him. Genesis 25. Just turn back one chapter, please. We'll progress to this generation, Isaac. Well, verse 19, this is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. I just want you to note that because these are family members back up in Padan Aram. Now that's north up there. I'm not going back to the map, but that's up in that area, the region rather, where Haran is located. So we're introduced to another person, Rebecca here, and now we know where she's from. We also know she is a sister to Laban. Keep that in mind. Now let's go to Genesis 27. Genesis chapter 27. I'll skim some of this because the story's kind of lengthy, but I think you know the story pretty well. We're skipping ahead now to near the end of Isaac's life. As a matter of fact, verse 1 tells us that. Genesis 27, verse 1, it came to pass when Isaac was old, his eyes were so dim he couldn't see. He calls Esau in, his older son, and he gives him these instructions. I think we know that pretty well. I'll just skim that. He tells him to go out, take your weapons, go out and hunt. Bring me some wild game. Prepare it, the savory food that I like. End of verse 4, he says, bring it that I may eat and that my soul may bless you before I die. Now, what this is, in briefest summary, is something that was very important back in that era, and that was the passing on of the blessing to the firstborn, the inheritance. That was far greater than what was given to the rest. If there were other siblings, and in this case, there is Esau and Jacob. They are the two sons of Isaac. And I think you know the story. Verse 5, Rebekah was listening. She hears or overhears Isaac giving these instructions to Esau. And what does she do? Verse 6, Rebekah spoke to Jacob. You remember? He's the boy she liked. Isaac was the boy that, or excuse me, Esau was the boy that Isaac liked. That's not good parenting. We talked about that in another Bible study, but they each had their favorite. But Rebecca is conniving here, if I could use that word. So she instructs Jacob, tells him, I heard your father speak to Esau, your brother, and she repeats the instructions. Down in verse 8, she says, now therefore, my son, she's talking to Jacob, you obey my voice according to what I command you. You going out of the flock, bring two choice kids from the goats, and I'm going to make savory food from them for your father, such as he loves. She intended to prepare it in the same way, I suppose, that the wild game would have tasted, perhaps the same spices and so forth, so that Isaac wouldn't know the difference. Verse 10, just skimming, you'll take it to your father that he may eat it and that he may bless you before his death. Now, they were twins. We presume born very close together in time, but regardless, Esau was the firstborn, and this blessing would have gone to him. But Rebekah is trying to, well, and they did work it out otherwise. I think you know what they did. In verse 11, Jacob said to Rebekah, now he did protest a little. He said, look, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, and so forth. So he's concerned. Dad might reach out and feel me, and this will result in a curse instead of a blessing. But mom's way ahead of him. She said, no. This is a crazy thing that she said in verse 13, but she said, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go. And then she puts those hairy skins on him, and they do manage to deceive Isaac. And I won't read all of this, but I think you know what happened. Isaac questioned it. He had his doubts and suspicions, but Jacob lied. He bluntly asked him. In verse 18, that is Jacob, went to his father and said, my father. He said, here I am. How are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I've done just as you told me. That is an outright lie. That is deception. Now, here we're getting into a dark side of the ancestry of Joseph. Jacob and his mother. His mother came up with the plan, but Jacob is complicit. And so he does eat. He does give the blessing to, matter of fact, let's just read a little of that. This is an incredible blessing that he's passing on. Verse 28. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brothers, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. And he just barely got out of there before Esau arrived. And of course, then the whole plot becomes clear, but it's too late. It's too late. What's the result of that? Stay in Genesis 27, but read another verse with me, verse 41. Genesis 27, verse 41. So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, here's what he's thinking in his mind. He's got a plan. The days of mourning for my father are at hand. In other words, Dad isn't going to live much longer. And what's he going to do once Dad has died? Into that verse, then I will kill my brother Jacob. But he must have uttered the words because, verse 42, the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. And so she tips off Jacob. And Jacob has to literally flee for his life. Let's skip to chapter 28, verse 1. Then Isaac called Jacob. By now he knows what has happened. But he goes ahead and he does give again a blessing, if you will, again, continuing chapter 28, verse 1. He calls Jacob and blessed him and charged him. He gives him some additional instructions here, and here's what he tells him. You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Remember, Abraham did not want Isaac to take a wife from the local tribes either. That's why he sent the steward all the way up there to extended family up there, back up Haran to get a wife for Isaac, which was Rebekah. But now he's essentially telling Jacob the same thing. He said, read now with me verse 2. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And then he continues, verse 3, may God Almighty bless you, make you fruitful, and multiply you, that you may be an assembly rather of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants with you. And he continues this. And so again, Isaac, though, has to get out of there because Esau intends to kill him as soon as Isaac dies. Chapter 29. I won't go back to that map, but remember, Jacob had to walk back a long ways, north, a little bit north, north and a little bit east. And so, verse 1, Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. Now, where is that? Verse 4. He comes upon a well and herdsmen and so forth. And verse 4, Jacob said to them, my brethren, where are you from? And they said, we are from Haran. So now he's back up where his father told him to go. Verse 5, he said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. So he said to them, is he well? And they said, he is well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. So I'm not going to read the whole account, but the first relative he actually meets is a lady that's going to be a future wife of his, Rachel, the daughter of Laban. Laban, his mother's brother. We're going to find out, as time allows here, some very interesting things about him. Let's go to let's see. Verse 14, please. Verse 14. I'm skipping things, but again, I'm only hitting the high spots so that we get a real good grasp of the family history that leads up to Joseph that we'll really zero in on later. So Jacob goes home with Rachel and those sheep. She gives a report to her father. Laban is, I think, genuinely happy. He's happy to meet a relative. And in verse 14, he said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. In other words, your family. And he stayed with him for a month. So after 1 month there in Laban's household, in verse 15, Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? In other words, I don't want you to just be a slave here. Tell me, what should your wages be? And verse 16. Very interesting. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older or the elder one was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And then we just get the briefest description about them in verse 17. Leah's eyes were delicate. And I've studied that in the past, and I studied it a little bit again. Commentaries vary on this, and actually there's some conflicting information on this. Delicate is probably not the best translation. Her eyes were probably weak. But there's something about her that's simply not attractive. Certainly not to Jacob. But the latter part of that verse, on the contrary, Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Nothing ever changes in human history. Jacob is a normal young man, and he has noticed. He's only been in that household 1 month, but Rachel has really caught his notice, and I'm sure her beauty, both in form and appearance, I don't have time to comment about that, but this has really drawn Jacob to her. Verse 18, it says, he loved Rachel. So he says, now, in the tradition of the time, wives were purchased in a sense. Remember what the servant of Abraham said when he went up there to seek a wife for Abraham. We just touched on that early in the study, and he was talking about all the wealth that Abraham had, and he brought many gifts. I didn't read that part, but he brought rather many gifts to, in a sense, purchase Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. Well, Jacob at this point has nothing. And our Beyond Today Bible commentary uh, has some pretty good description of that. So instead, he says, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. I find this very, very interesting. So let's look. Well, Laban makes the deal if we read on just a little bit. Laban said, verse 19, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. So this is a genuine love, a genuine commitment, working 7 years just so that he could have this beautiful young woman as his wife. And then, verse 21, he says to Laban, after these 7 years, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled. Now, I want to read a quote from our Beyond Today Bible commentary at this point. This is the commentary on Genesis 29. Just a little bit of it, but here's a quote. God is about to embark on a long course of knocking Jacob down to a more humble self-appraisal. He's using Laban as a significant tool in the process. Now, this next couple sentences is interesting. Jacob may have been a smooth operator in Canaan, but he can in no way compare to the devious Laban. Jacob has unknowingly met his match, unquote. I found that pretty poignant out of our own Beyond Today Bible commentary describing this situation. We've already read about uh, Rebekah and her deceit of her own husband, Isaac, and Jacob was complicit. Well, Laban is her brother. Now we're looking at what I might call a dark side of Joseph's ancestry. We're seeing that in these people. They're industrious, they're prosperous, they're go-getters, if I could put it that way. But they have this real character flaw, and Laban is probably the worst. Skimming ahead, Jacob then asks for his wife. I guess I read that, verse 21, that he can consummate his marriage. In verse 12, Laban gathered together all the men of the place, and they made a feast. That was the tradition of the time, and it came to pass in the evening, he brings Leah, his daughter. This is Leah now, not Rachel. He brings her to Jacob, and he goes into her. Now, our Beyond Today Bible commentary and other commentaries have quite a bit of information on this. This wasn't deceit. Well, it's outright deceit because it's the wrong woman. But the custom of the time was a bride was completely veiled. Completely veiled. And they would go into this, it's night now. They go into this dark tent, consummate the marriage. But the problem is, Jacob doesn't know who he's with. Also, we'll just note something quickly in verse 24. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So the maid goes with her, becomes Leah's property. But verse 25, it comes to pass in the morning that behold, it was Leah. And Jacob says to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? We'll discuss that later after the study. Remember again what we read just a short time ago. Jacob has really met his match here. His uncle Laban. Laban has an excuse in verse 26. Part of this could be valid, but it doesn't matter. He has outright deceived Jacob. But he says, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week. I'm not giving a lot of commentary and background on these verses, but that too was a custom 1 week, uh, especially with your bride. So he says, fulfill her week. This would be now Leah's week. And we will give you this one also for the service, which you will serve with me still another 7 years. So after 7 days, he's going to give Rachel also as a wife to Jacob. But the deal is, you work for me 7 more years. This is going to be 14 years of service for 2 wives, one he didn't even want. So in verse 28, Jacob really doesn't have much choice. He does this, fulfilled her week. So then he, that is Laban, also gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. And then Laban also gave another maid, Bilhah, to his daughter Rachel as a maid. And so Jacob also consummates marriage with Rachel. And it says, verse 30, he also loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served Laban, or with Laban, still another 7 years. Jacob is really beginning to learn some very hard lessons here. Now, we'll skim a few more verses. Verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, Jacob has no real feelings for this woman at all. He's been duped, and he can't get out of the marriage, but he doesn't love her. And the Lord sees this. Now, he could have been more noble about it, but Jacob still has things to learn as well. So when he sees again that Leah is unloved, if you're reading the original King James, it actually says she is hated. That's a much stronger word, but if you read the Hebrew, that is accurate. So the Lord notices it. In the middle part of verse 31, he opened her womb. Apparently, neither Leah, and we'll see later, nor Rachel were able to bear children. That was also a real family trait. Could have been pure coincidence, but remember, Sarah couldn't bear children. For how long? 25 years after Abram received the promise of this son. Later, Rebekah couldn't bear children. But Isaac handled it better. He pleaded with God, and then God allowed her to have children, namely Esau and Jacob. Now, 2 more women who initially apparently couldn't bear children, but the Lord notices Leah is just hated. And so he opens her womb, but Rachel was or remains barren. In other words, she can't have children. Verse 32, Leah conceived. She bears a son, calls him Reuben. And notice what she said. The Lord has surely looked upon my affliction. Now, therefore, my husband will love me. She's hoping somehow, now that we have a child together, this is going to change things. She conceives again. Verse 33, bears another son. And she said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So first she has Reuben, now she has Simeon. And then verse 34, she conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. And she calls him Levi. She conceives again, verse 35, bears another son and says now she's going to praise the Lord, and she calls him Judah. Now into verse 35, it says, then she stopped bearing. Actually, in a more modern translation, it simply says she stopped having children. Apparently, that could have been of God, or it could have been a natural consequence. We just don't know. Let me go on here to chapter 30. Rachel just can't deal with this. These two sisters. In verse 1, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. Envied. She becomes so jealous and despondent over not being able to have children. She says to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." In other words, this is going to kill me. And then Jacob gets angry. He said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" You know, he's stating the truth, but can you imagine the frustration in this household? Rachel comes up with a plan. It's not a good one, but nevertheless, it's a plan. Verse 3, so she said, "Here is my maid, Bilhah. You go into her." In other words, he's going to take her as a wife. It doesn't use the word here, but essentially she becomes a concubine, a servant wife, nevertheless a wife. Now, continuing verse 3, "And she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." So, in other words, Bilhah will become a surrogate mother. So she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife. Note that word. She actually becomes another wife, but in a lower social status. So Jacob consummates marriage to her, and she apparently conceives, we presume, quickly, and she bears a son. And Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son." Now it's through another woman, but she, again, sees her as a surrogate. She takes this man as her son, calls him Dan. Verse 7, the maid conceives again and bears Jacob a second son. And verse 8, Rachel said, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." And she calls him Naphtali, or Naphtali, as some scholars will say. You know, if I might put it this way, this is just a little bit crazy, isn't it? But these are desperate people, these two women. Let me continue. Let's go to verse 8. I have covered that. I wanted to read that last part from the New English translation where I have wrestled with my sister and prevailed. This is the New English. It says, "I have fought a desperate struggle with my sister, but I have won." It's like a competition here. Very unhealthy. Verse 9, it shifts again because now Leah tries to gain the upper hand again. She's already bore 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, to Jacob. But now she wants to gain the upper hand again in verse 9. She saw that she had stopped bearing. In other words, at this time, she can't have any more children. So she takes Zilpah, her maid, and she gives her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bears Jacob a son. And Leah says, "A troop comes." She calls him Gad. And then verse 12, this maid Zilpah bears Jacob a second son. And notice verse 13, what Leah says, "I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed." And then she names this son Asher. Now, I want to skip ahead. Leah's still miserable. Rachel, there's this competition. I just don't have time to read all of this, but verse 17, the Lord sees all of this. Verse 17, same chapter, chapter 30. "And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son." And now she says, "God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband." She calls him Issachar, and then she has yet another son. Verse 19, she conceives again and bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called him Zebulun. You know what a sad, tragic situation we're reading here. I was just going to pause a moment. I have on occasion had, I haven't had this recently, but on occasion during my years as a minister, I've had questions almost always from men. Even though the law of the land in the United States prohibits bigamy, 2 wives, or polygamy, 3 or more, men read these accounts in the Bible. Well, of course, women read them too, but again, um, I've most often had the comments from men, the Bible really doesn't condemn this. Is it really wrong to have more than one wife? Men, get your thinking straight. First of all the way back at the beginning, God created Adam and Eve, and he did not add Mary and Judy and but God is all wise. That was the pattern. A man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, singular. Later on, you get out in the New Testament, the instructions to Timothy and to Titus when they were to evaluate and select men to be elders and deacons. One of the qualifications was they were to be the husband of one wife. Don't ever forget that. Now, God allowed these things. I know that. I understand that. But it's not healthy, never was, never will be. And again, we're talking about the ancestors of Joseph, and we're going to see how this impacted him later on. Now, finally, if you're still in chapter 30, stay there with me, but now read verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her. He finally heeds what was apparently her pleas that she could have children, and in the King James language, opened her womb. In other words, now she's able to bear children. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph. Joseph literally means judgment. And she said, the Lord shall add to me another son. She had this hope. And indeed, that did happen later on. And so finally, Rachel here has her first son, Joseph, which will be the focus of pretty much from here on in our study. Another son did happen in verse, let's see, where do I want to read? Let's go to, well, let's simply read verse 25. It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. And we don't have time to read much of what happens in between. Um, you know, Jacob didn't immediately leave. If I could just very briefly summarize some of the things in the following verses and chapters, Jacob essentially learned his lesson. He was an outstanding steward and manager for Laban, and essentially, ultimately, Jacob leaves with not only his wives, but he leaves with the bulk of Laban's wealth. He finally learned his lesson. He began to do things honestly. Remember, there's a phrase in here. Jacob told Laban, you changed my wages 10 times. Laban, the master deceiver, Jacob truly met his match, as our Bible commentary says. And it really humbled Jacob. And he learned to become an honest and an upright man. He talks about how he had taken care of the flocks. If a wild beast or a thief uh, came and tore or stole an animal, he said, I made that up from my own. He finally becomes a man of very noble character. And to his credit, we have to acknowledge that of Jacob. Now, let's go all the way over to chapter 35. I really need to wind down here. Chapter 35, in verse 16. We've jumped ahead quite a ways, but in Genesis 35, verse 16, now Jacob and his entire household, all the wives and 11 sons, are down in Canaan. They journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had hard labor, it says. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, don't fear, you will have this son also. And so it was as her soul was departing. In other words, she died in childbirth. She managed to um, give a name, although Isaac immediately, I'm sorry, not Isaac, Jacob immediately changed it. His father, end of verse 18, calls this last son Benjamin. And then it simply says, verse 19, Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And he mourns and puts a pillar by her grave and so forth. So that completes the family. Now, I want to share my screen once more. I'm going to go back where we were. Let me make this a full screen. I just want to give you a visual list. Here are the 12 sons of Jacob in birth order. The first four, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah from Leah. Fifth and sixth sons are from Bilhah, Rachel's maid, Dan and Naphtali. Then remember, Leah gives her maid to Jacob as a wife. So sons 7 and 8, Gad and Asher, come from this other maid, Zilpah. Then Leah bears children again. Sons 9 and 10 are Issachar and Zebulun. And finally, the 11th son is Joseph from Rachel. Finally, the wife that Jacob truly loved bears a son, Joseph. I just put his name in a bolder font because that will become the focus from here on. And then, of course, by the way, all 11 of those brothers were born up in Padan Aram, and only Benjamin, the 12th son, is born back down there in Canaan after Jacob returned to what was his homeland. So I think, again, that just helps you understand a little bit of um, this mixed up household, if I could put it that way. So I'm going to take that down again and wrap up talking to you face to face. Now, Genesis 37, one more verse. Two more verses. Genesis 37, first verse. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. They were all sojourners there. And then it says, verse 2, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph becomes a focal point from now on. Chapters 37 all the way through 50 have frequent mention of Joseph and a whole lot about him. So continuing, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And then it says, and I'll continue here next time, and he brought a bad report of them to his father. So here we have direct references to Joseph. He's living with the sons of the maids. Notice that. Leah is not mentioned. We presume Leah doesn't want him around. It's still all of the trouble that is still in that household, and we're going to read a whole lot more about that in part two of this Bible study. But I hope you find this interesting and informative. All of these traits in the ancestry of Joseph. And now we'll be able to build on this in part two of this study in 4 weeks when we come back to it. So before I stop the recording, for those who will see this later, I do want to pose the discussion questions. And those of you that are with me on the web tonight, please stick with me. I think we can have some interesting discussion. But here are the two questions. Number one, have you observed family traits that carry on through succeeding generations that have either negative or positive impact? And would you care to share an example? Second question, what can we learn from the consequences of Jacob being complicit in the deceit of his father to gain the blessings reserved for the firstborn? What do we learn from those consequences? I think we can have a profitable little discussion. I will now cut off the recording. For those of you that see the recording later, I hope you find it interesting.